You are listening to Particular Pilgrims, stories from Reformed Baptist history with commentary. I'm your host, Ron Miller, pastor of Covenant Baptist Church of Clarksville, Tennessee, and a longtime student and collector of Particular Baptist history. This is brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. The English and American Particular Baptists of the 17th and 18th centuries were not a standalone sect with no connection to other forms of true Christianity. They did not have their own scriptures or claim to be the only true believers in God through Jesus Christ. Put positively, they were orthodox, Protestant, Reformed, and Puritan Christians. But they were also more than that. They were distinguished from other churches by a set of distinctives, a number of interconnected doctrines and practices that set them apart. These they thought to be both scriptural and the logical outcome of their previous Reformed and Puritan commitments. They considered themselves to be the only thorough religious reformers, as one Baptist put it. This complex of distinct beliefs revolved around the doctrine of the church, and together they constitute the distinct Baptist identity. As such, these things were held in common by both particular and general Baptists. These distinctives have been historically recognized ever since the Baptist beginnings of the early 1600s, and while they have been named, defined, and grouped in different ways, they include the following interrelated doctrines and practices: believer's baptism by immersion, regenerate church membership, liberty of conscience, and the separation of church and state. Notice that all of these are associated aspects of a consistent biblical ecclesiology. They are the outworkings of the Baptist understanding of how the New Covenant church should be scripturally constructed and function under its head, Jesus Christ. For these principles, they did not lean on the example of Old Testament Israel or the mixed Roman or Reformed church models. Instead, they followed the lead of the Puritan independents and from Scripture further refined their idea of a church being a body of visible saints. Let's define in short form each of these distinctives. The first distinctive, believer's baptism by immersion, is the idea that only those with a credible profession of faith and life should be accepted for baptism, and that the only biblical baptism is immersion into water. Baptism that pleases the head of the church is the dipping of visible saints. The second distinctive, regenerate church membership, means that the church should consist of regenerate persons. It should not include their children, unless those children have been reborn by the Spirit of God. The ideal is for no believers to have communion with the church. This general biblical principle they learned from the Puritan independents, but since that group retained infant baptism, they struggled to live out this rule consistently. The third distinctive, liberty of conscience or soul liberty, is the right of private judgment in religious matters. As the 1689 Confession sums it up, quote, God alone is Lord of the conscience. So men are responsible and free before God for their own religious practice without coercion from other individuals, churches, or civil powers. Sometimes also called freedom of religion or soul competency, it historically has included defending the rights of all, including those of different faiths, to peaceably practice their religion. The fourth distinction, the separation of church and state, follows from these. It teaches that the government should not force religious belief or practice. The civil authorities should not intrude into the sphere of the church, nor should the church interfere in the civil sphere. These distinctives define and support each other. Like the 5 points of Calvinism, they are an all or nothing deal. They stand or fall together. Now, that doesn't mean that every definition of them over the centuries has been consistent or consistently applied. It doesn't mean that every Baptist has viewed them identically. As we look at this topic in Baptist life, there will be development, refinement, and consistency, or even the obvious lack of it. There have been some who have, for example, overemphasized soul liberty to the very destruction of orthodoxy. Others have taken a position that leans in the direction of theonomy, which is fundamentally at odds with a Baptist identity. Others have joined or replaced the Baptist view of the separation of church and state with a secular one, which promotes the removal of all religious influence from government. But none of these, or other confusions, changes the fact that these beliefs are historical and necessary Baptist distinctives. The founders did not root their view of liberty in political or philosophical principles, but in scriptural teaching. It was the New Covenant documents, not the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or secularism, that is at the root of these Baptist views. I've only given very short definitions because I want you to hear fuller ones directly from our Baptist fathers and mothers. Over the centuries, they strove to understand, defend, and live up to these principles in real-life contexts. And it's out of those challenges that we will read their often passionate defense of these distinctives. The earliest writings from Baptists on religious liberty were from the General Baptists. This is because they were formed out of the separatist movement about 30 years before the Particular Baptists. But as those who believed in a regenerate church, the concept of religious liberty necessarily followed. And so it is not coincidental that the earliest writings in English on soul liberty came from their hands. Some of you may wonder why in a podcast entitled Particular Pilgrims, I'm including some non-particular sources. There are several reasons. One is that these ecclesiological topics are not directly related to disagreements about the doctrines of grace. They're really not dependent in any way. The generals and particulars shared other areas of orthodoxy, at least until the General Baptists began to apostatize in the early 1700s. But by then, their views on religious liberty had been established for 100 years. But more than that, when the particulars began writing on this subject, it is clear that they depended upon and even reprinted the General Baptists' views. Just like I've included non-Baptistic Reformed Church views in some of the episodes where the particulars learned from them and agreed, I'm doing the same thing here with the General Baptists. Religious liberty in the 17th century was a Baptist tenet, and almost exclusively a Baptist tenet, not exclusively a particular Baptist one. My plan is to bring you a series of historically sensitive and contextually accurate portrayals of important Baptist writings on liberty of conscience. Next time, I'll begin with some General Baptist men and tracts, and then move forward into the line of particular Baptist proponents. Thank you for listening today. This is Ron the Baptist wishing you grace and peace.